The scene is set. The investigation begins.
Number 10. The Bath School Disaster, 1927. On May 18, 1927, the quiet farming community of Bath Township, Michigan, became the site of the deadliest school massacre in American history, a catastrophic act of violence that would claim 45 lives and injure 58 others in an explosion that literally tore apart the heart of a small town. Andrew Kehoe, a 55-year-old farmer and former school board treasurer, had spent months meticulously planning an act of destruction so comprehensive and calculated that it revealed a mind consumed by rage, financial desperation, and a twisted desire to punish an entire community for what he perceived as personal injustices. Kehoe had been facing foreclosure on his farm, a situation he blamed entirely on increased property taxes levied to fund the construction of the new consolidated Bath School, and this financial pressure, combined with what many later described as an increasingly unstable mental state and a volatile temperament that had manifested in acts of cruelty toward animals and explosive outbursts toward neighbors, created the perfect storm for unprecedented violence. In the months leading up to the massacre, Kehoe had systematically purchased and stockpiled hundreds of pounds of pyritol, a form of explosive material used in World War I, and had secretly installed this explosive throughout the basement and crawl spaces of the Bath Consolidated School during his work on the school board, which gave him unrestricted access to the building and allowed him to wire the entire north wing of the school with enough explosive power to level the structure. On the morning of May 18th, Kehoe first murdered his wife Nellie by bludgeoning her to death, then set incendiary devices throughout his farm buildings to destroy all his property and assets, ensuring that the bank foreclosing on his property would receive nothing but ashes and rubble. At approximately 8:45 in the morning, as children settled into their classrooms for another day of lessons, Kehoe detonated the explosives he had planted in the north wing of the school, and the massive explosion that followed was heard miles away, instantly collapsing the entire north section of the two-story building and burying hundreds of children and teachers under tons of brick, wood, and debris in what witnesses described as a scene of absolute carnage and chaos. Parents and community members rushed to the school and began frantically digging through the rubble with their bare hands, pulling out injured and dead children as the scope of the horror became apparent, with bodies of young students crushed beyond recognition and others suffering from catastrophic injuries that would prove fatal in the hours that followed. As rescuers worked desperately to save those trapped in the collapsed building, Kehoe arrived at the scene in his truck, and when Superintendent Emery Hike approached the vehicle to speak with him, Kehoe detonated a final explosive device he had rigged in his vehicle, killing himself, the superintendent, a retired farmer named Nelson McFarren, and a second grader named Cleo Clayton, who had survived the initial school explosion only to die in this second blast. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of Kehoe's planning, including the discovery of an additional 500 pounds of unexploded pyritol still wired throughout the south wing of the school that had failed to detonate due to a faulty connection, a failure that undoubtedly prevented the death toll from climbing even higher and potentially doubling the number of casualties. Investigators also found Kehoe's farm completely destroyed by fire, with his wife's charred remains discovered in a wheelbarrow near the ruins of their home, and a wooden sign wired to a fence on his property that read "Criminals are made, not born," a chilling statement that Kehoe apparently believed justified his actions and shifted blame for his violence onto society itself. The final death toll stood at 45 people killed, including 38 elementary school children ranging in age from 7 to 14 years old, 2 teachers, for other adults including Kehoe himself and his wife, making it the deadliest act of mass murder in a school in United States history, a grim record that stands to this day. The community of Bath Township was devastated not only by the loss of life but by the complete destruction of their school and the realization that someone they had known and worked alongside had harbored such murderous intent without anyone recognizing the warning signs or the danger he posed. In the aftermath, the community rebuilt, constructing a new school on the same site and establishing a memorial to honor the victims, while the massacre itself became a largely forgotten chapter in American history, overshadowed by later acts of school violence but remaining the single deadliest school attack in the nation's history. Kehoe himself left no manifesto beyond that single cryptic sign, and while financial pressures and mental instability clearly played roles in his actions, the full motivation behind his decision to murder dozens of children as revenge for his personal failures remains incomprehensible to this day, a reminder that the darkest acts of violence often emerge from a combination of personal grievance, psychological deterioration, and access to the means of mass destruction. Number 9. The Orangeburg Massacre, 1968. On the night of February 8, 1968, on the campus of South Carolina State University in Orangeburg, South Carolina, law enforcement officers opened fire on a group of unarmed African-American student protesters, killing 3 young men and wounding 28 others in what became known as the Orangeburg Massacre, a tragic event that exposed the violent resistance to civil rights progress in the American South and revealed the willingness of state authorities to use lethal force against peaceful demonstrators seeking basic human dignity and equal treatment under the law. The events leading to the massacre began several days earlier when students from South Carolina State University and nearby Claflin University attempted to desegregate the All-Star Bowling Lane, one of the last segregated public facilities in Orangeburg, and when the students were refused service and forcibly removed from the establishment, they began organizing protests and demonstrations to challenge this continued segregation in violation of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Over the following days, tensions escalated as students continued their protests at the bowling alley, leading to violent confrontations with police, mass arrests of student demonstrators, and increasingly aggressive tactics by law enforcement who viewed the civil rights activism as a threat to public order rather than a legitimate expression of constitutional rights. On the evening of February 8th, approximately 200 students gathered on the campus of South Carolina State University near the front of the campus, building a bonfire and expressing their frustration with the violent treatment they had received during previous protests. And while the demonstration was loud and animated, witnesses consistently testified that the students were unarmed and posed no immediate threat to the nearly 100 law enforcement officers, including South Carolina Highway Patrol, Orangeburg Police, and wildlife officers who had surrounded the campus. As the evening progressed, students threw objects including bottles and pieces of wood toward a line of officers, and at approximately 10:30 p.m., some students allegedly threw a wooden banister that struck a highway patrolman, and in response, without warning or order to disperse, 9 highway patrolmen opened fire with shotguns and rifles directly into the crowd of students, unleashing a barrage of gunfire that lasted between 8 and 10 seconds and sent protesters running in terror as buckshot and bullets tore through the crowd. When the shooting stopped, 3 young men lay dead or dying on the campus grounds, including Samuel Hammond Jr., an 18-year-old freshman and star athlete who was shot in the back while trying to protect his face and died at the scene, Delano Middleton, a 17-year-old high school student who was walking home from work and stopped to watch the demonstration only to be shot in the heart and killed instantly, and Henry Smith, a 19-year-old sophomore who was shot multiple times and died later that night from his wounds, while 28 other students suffered gunshot injuries ranging from minor wounds to life-altering disabilities. The immediate aftermath of the shooting was marked by a systematic effort by law enforcement and state officials to portray the students as violent agitators who had initiated the confrontation and to justify the use of lethal force as necessary self-defense, with Governor Robert McNair declaring that the incident was sparked by student violence and characterizing the victims as rioters rather than protesters exercising their constitutional rights. However, detailed investigations, including examinations by the FBI and independent analysis of the evidence, revealed a starkly different picture, showing that all 3 students who were killed had been shot in the back or side while attempting to flee, that none of the students were armed with firearms, and that the officers had fired without provocation or proper justification into a crowd of people who were retreating from the confrontation. Despite the overwhelming evidence that the shooting was unjustified and that the officers had used excessive and deadly force against unarmed students, not a single law enforcement officer was ever charged with murder, manslaughter, or any criminal offense related to the deaths of the 3 students. Instead, in a profound miscarriage of justice that highlighted the racial inequalities of the American legal system, 9 student protesters were arrested and charged with various offenses related to the demonstrations, while the officer who had been struck by the wooden banister and whose injury was used to justify the shooting had suffered only a minor head wound that required no medical treatment. The lack of accountability for the officers who killed 3 unarmed students and wounded 28 others stood in stark contrast to the widespread attention and prosecution that followed the Kent State shootings just 2 years later, and civil rights advocates pointed to this disparity as evidence that Black lives and Black victims of state violence were systematically devalued and ignored by American society and the justice system. It took nearly 3 decades before any measure of accountability emerged, when in 1993, former Governor McNair publicly stated that he had been wrong in his initial characterization of the events, and that the students had been the victims rather than the instigators of violence. And in 2001, the state of South Carolina issued an official apology and agreed to a settlement with survivors and families of the victims. In 2003, 35 years after the massacre, Cleveland Sellers, a prominent civil rights activist and the only person ever convicted of crimes related to the Orangeburg Massacre, received a full pardon from the state, finally acknowledging the injustice of prosecuting the victims while allowing the perpetrators to escape accountability. The Orangeburg Massacre remains a lesser-known but critically important chapter in the history of the civil rights movement, demonstrating that the struggle for racial equality was met not only with legal and social resistance, but with state-sanctioned violence and murder, and that the lives of young Black Americans fighting for their constitutional rights were deemed expendable by those sworn to protect and serve all citizens equally, a legacy of injustice that continues to resonate in contemporary discussions of police violence and racial inequality in America. Number 8. The San Ysidro McDonald's Massacre, 1984. On July 18, 1984, in the San Diego suburban community of San Ysidro, California, 41-year-old James Oliver Huberty walked into a McDonald's restaurant armed with multiple firearms and methodically murdered 21 people, while wounding 19 others in a 77-minute rampage that represented one of the deadliest mass shootings by a single gunman in American history and shattered the sense of safety that Americans had long associated with everyday public spaces. Huberty, an unemployed security guard and welder who had recently moved to California from Ohio with his wife and 2 daughters, had been experiencing increasing mental instability, paranoia, and rage in the months leading up to the massacre, exacerbated by his inability to find steady employment, his belief that society and government had failed him, and what family members later described as a growing obsession with perceived injustices and a desire to exact revenge on a world he felt had wronged him. On the morning of July 18th, Huberty had attended a career counseling session that apparently did not go well, and he spent the afternoon at home with his family before telling his wife that he was going hunting for humans, a statement she later said she did not take seriously at the time, believing he was making a dark joke rather than announcing his actual intentions. At approximately 3:40 p.m., Huberty entered the McDonald's restaurant located at 460 West San Ysidro Boulevard, a location he had chosen apparently at random or simply because of its proximity to his home, carrying a 9mm Browning HP semi-automatic pistol, a 9mm Uzi semi-automatic carbine, and a 12-gauge Winchester pump-action shotgun, along with hundreds of rounds of ammunition that he had methodically prepared and organized for maximum killing efficiency. Upon entering the restaurant, which was crowded with families, children, and workers during the busy lunch hour rush, Huberty immediately opened fire, shooting the first customers he encountered and then systematically moving through the restaurant, targeting anyone he could see and showing no hesitation, remorse, or selectivity in choosing his victims, killing children as young as 8 months old alongside teenagers, adults, and elderly patrons with cold, methodical precision. Witnesses who survived the attack described Huberty as calm and deliberate in his actions, walking through the restaurant and outdoor seating area, firing at people who were hiding under tables, shooting victims multiple times to ensure they were dead, and even targeting people who were attempting to flee through the restaurant's exits or crawl to safety, demonstrating a level of calculation and intent that went beyond random violence to something approaching systematic execution. As the shooting continued, terrified survivors called police, and within minutes, San Diego Police Department officers arrived at the scene and established a perimeter around the restaurant. But the situation quickly became complicated by the layout of the building, the number of hostages and victims still inside, and Huberty's heavily armed position that allowed him to continue shooting at both people inside the restaurant and officers attempting to approach from outside. For over an hour, Huberty controlled the McDonald's, occasionally pausing to reload his weapons, moving between different areas of the restaurant to target survivors he had initially missed, and engaging in brief exchanges of gunfire with police officers who were attempting to position themselves for a clear shot while minimizing additional casualties. The massacre finally ended at 5:17 p.m. when SWAT sniper Chuck Foster, positioned on the roof of the post office building across the street, fired a single shot from his Remington 700 rifle that struck Huberty in the chest, killing him instantly and bringing an end to the 77-minute rampage that had turned a family restaurant into a slaughterhouse. The final death toll stood at 21 victims killed, including 8 children, with ages ranging from 8 months to 74 years, representing a cross-section of the community and including Mexican nationals who had crossed the border to visit the restaurant, demonstrating that Huberty's violence was indiscriminate and motivated by generalized rage rather than targeting any specific group. An additional 19 people suffered gunshot wounds, many of them severe and life-threatening, and the psychological trauma inflicted on survivors, witnesses, and the entire San Ysidro community would persist for decades, with many survivors experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder, survivor's guilt, and an inability to return to normal life after witnessing such extreme violence. The investigation into Huberty's background revealed a troubled individual with a history of mental health issues, including paranoia, violent ideation, and possible undiagnosed psychological disorders. And just days before the massacre, Huberty had actually called a mental health clinic seeking an appointment, identifying himself as having problems and needing help, but due to a clerical error, his call was never returned, raising devastating questions about whether intervention at that critical moment might have prevented the tragedy. The massacre led to significant changes in how law enforcement agencies across the country prepared for and responded to active shooter situations, with the San Ysidro incident serving as a case study in tactical response and helping to develop protocols for engaging armed suspects in populated areas. The McDonald's restaurant where the massacre occurred was demolished in 1985, and the site was eventually converted into a memorial park honoring the victims, providing a peaceful space for reflection in a community that had been forever changed by 77 minutes of incomprehensible violence. The families of victims filed wrongful death lawsuits against McDonald's Corporation and the mental health clinic that failed to return Huberty's call, ultimately reaching settlements, though no amount of money could compensate for the lives lost or the trauma inflicted on survivors and loved ones. The San Ysidro McDonald's massacre marked a turning point in American consciousness about mass shootings in public spaces, shattering the illusion that everyday locations like restaurants, schools, and shopping centers were immune from such violence and forcing a national reckoning with the reality that anyone, anywhere, could become a victim of a determined killer armed with high-capacity firearms and consumed by rage against a society they blamed for their personal failures and disappointments. Number 7. The Greensboro Massacre, 1979. On November 3, 1979, in Greensboro, North Carolina, members of the Ku Klux Klan and the American Nazi Party opened fire on a group of anti-Klan protesters during a Death to the Klan rally, killing 5 people and wounding 10 others in a massacre that was captured on film by television news cameras, and that exposed both the continuing violent threat posed by white supremacist organizations and the alleged complicity of law enforcement in allowing the attack to occur. The events leading to the Greensboro Massacre began when the Communist Workers' Party, a Marxist organization committed to labor organizing and anti-racist activism, planned a march and rally in Greensboro's predominantly black Morningside Homes housing project to protest Klan activity and to build support for a local textile worker strike. In the weeks before the rally, CWP organizers had issued provocative challenges to local Klan groups, calling them cowards and inviting them to confront the protesters directly, statements that were intended to expose the Klan's history of terrorism while building publicity for the anti-racist demonstration. These public challenges were monitored by local law enforcement and federal agencies, and critically, by an informant named Edward Dawson who was simultaneously a Klan member and a paid FBI informant, creating a situation where authorities had advanced knowledge of potential violence but failed to take adequate steps to prevent it. On the morning of November 3rd, approximately 100 protesters gathered for the Death to the Klan march, including CWP members, labor activists, community organizers, and local residents, and as they assembled in a parking lot near Morningside Homes, a caravan of 9 vehicles carrying approximately 40 Klan members and Nazis, many of them armed with handguns, rifles, and shotguns, arrived at the location. What happened next was captured on video by multiple television news crews who had been covering the protest, and the footage shows that after a brief confrontation involving shouted insults and some physical altercations, Klan and Nazi members opened the trunks of their vehicles, retrieved firearms, and began shooting directly into the crowd of protesters at close range, firing dozens of shots in a sustained attack that lasted approximately 88 seconds. The victims had virtually no time to react or seek cover as bullets tore through the crowd, and when the shooting stopped, 5 people lay dead or dying, including Cesar Cos, a 25-year-old Cuban immigrant and Duke University graduate who was shot in the head, Dr. Michael Nathan, a 33-year-old physician and chief of pediatrics at a local hospital who had dedicated his career to serving poor communities, and who was shot multiple times, Dr. James Waller, a 37-year-old graduate of Harvard Divinity School and president of a local textile workers union who died from gunshot wounds to the head and torso, Bill Sampson, a 31-year-old civil rights and labor activist who was killed by multiple gunshots, and Sandra Smith, a 30-year-old nurse and mother who died from gunshot wounds, all of them committed activists who had devoted their lives to fighting for racial and economic justice. 10 others suffered gunshot wounds, and the psychological trauma of witnessing the attack affected scores of protesters, community members, and even the journalists whose cameras had recorded the massacre. In the immediate aftermath of the shooting, Greensboro police arrested several Klan and Nazi members who were still at the scene, but the initial response by law enforcement was widely criticized as inadequate given that authorities had advance warning of potential violence, and questions immediately arose about why uniformed police officers were not present at the scene despite knowing that armed Klan members planned to confront the protesters. The investigation revealed disturbing connections between the attackers and law enforcement, including the role of Edward Dawson, the FBI informant who had helped organize the Klan caravan and who had communicated with police about the plans, and Bernard Butkovich, an agent with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms who had infiltrated the Nazi Party and who was present during the planning of the attack but whose agency failed to alert local police or take steps to prevent the violence. Despite the fact that the massacre was captured on film from multiple angles, showing clearly that Klan and Nazi members had initiated the gunfire and had shot unarmed protesters, the subsequent legal proceedings resulted in shocking acquittals that demonstrated the racial bias inherent in the criminal justice system and the reluctance of all white juries to hold white supremacists accountable for violence against leftist activists. In the first criminal trial held in state court in 1980, 6 Klan and Nazi members were charged with murder and felonious riot. But after a trial in which defense attorneys portrayed the victims as dangerous communists who had provoked the attack and characterized the killings as self-defense despite video evidence to the contrary, the all-white jury acquitted all defendants on all charges. A second federal criminal trial in 1984, in which 9 defendants were charged with violating the civil rights of the victims, resulted in another complete acquittal, again by an all-white jury that apparently accepted defense arguments that the shooters had acted in self-defense. Finally, in a civil trial in 1985, a jury found certain Klan members, Nazi members, and Greensboro police officers liable for the wrongful death of Dr. Michael Nathan, awarding his widow a monetary judgment and finally providing some measure of legal acknowledgement that the massacre had been unjustified and that law enforcement had failed in its duty to protect the protesters. The Greensboro Massacre and the subsequent failure of the criminal justice system to hold anyone accountable for 5 murders committed in broad daylight and captured on film had a chilling effect on anti-racist organizing and demonstrated that white supremacist violence could still be committed with virtual impunity in late 20th century America. The city of Greensboro itself struggled for decades to acknowledge and address the massacre, with official denial and minimization giving way only gradually to truth and reconciliation efforts, including the establishment of the Greensboro Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 2004, the first such commission in American history modeled on the South African post-apartheid process, which conducted extensive investigations and hearings to establish a complete historical record of the events and to promote healing in a community still divided by the legacy of the massacre. The Commission's final report, released in 2006, concluded that the violence had been a joint attack by Klan and Nazi members, that Greensboro police had failed to fulfill their duty to protect citizens, and that the failure to convict anyone of criminal charges had compounded the harm and prevented justice, findings that provided official validation for survivors and families who had fought for decades to have the truth acknowledged. The 5 people killed in the Greensboro Massacre were all committed activists who believed in building a more just and equitable society, and their deaths at the hands of white supremacists, followed by the complete failure of the criminal justice system to deliver accountability, stands as a stark reminder of the continuing threat posed by organized racism and the willingness of some elements within law enforcement and the legal system to enable and protect those who commit violence in service of white supremacy and fascist ideology. Number 6. The Tulsa Race Massacre, 1921 on May 31st and June 1st, 1921. In Tulsa, Oklahoma, white mobs attacked the prosperous African-American community of Greenwood, known as Black Wall Street, for its concentration of black-owned businesses and wealth, systematically burning over 35 blocks of the district, murdering as many as 300 black residents, and leaving thousands homeless in what remains one of the worst incidents of racial violence in American history and one of the most successful attempts to destroy black economic prosperity and self-determination. The events that sparked the massacre began on May 30th, 1921, when 19-year-old Dick Rowland, a black shoe shiner, entered an elevator in the Drexel building in downtown Tulsa operated by 17-year-old Sarah Page, a white woman, and at some point during or immediately after this elevator ride, Page screamed and Rowland fled the building, leading to accusations that would never be clearly substantiated that Rowland had assaulted Page, though later evidence strongly suggested that Rowland had simply stumbled and grabbed Page's arm to steady himself, or that the entire incident had been blown out of proportion or even fabricated. Nevertheless, on May 31st, Rowland was arrested and taken to the Tulsa County Courthouse, and by afternoon, the Tulsa Tribune had published inflammatory articles about the alleged assault, including an editorial headline "To Lynch Negro Tonight," which inflamed white sentiment and led to a mob of white men gathering outside the courthouse demanding that Rowland be turned over to them for lynching. As news of the threatened lynching reached Greenwood, a group of armed black men, many of them World War I veterans, traveled to the courthouse to offer assistance to law enforcement in protecting Rowland from the lynch mob, an act that reflected both the community's determination to prevent another lynching and their faith that they could work with authorities to ensure justice. However, when this group of approximately 75 armed black men arrived at the courthouse and offered their help, they were rebuffed by police, and as they prepared to leave, a confrontation occurred between a black man and a white man trying to disarm him. A shot was fired, and the violence that followed would transform from a potential lynching into a full-scale massacre and destruction of an entire community. After the initial gunfire, both groups retreated to their respective areas of the city, but throughout the night and into the next morning, white mobs began gathering weapons and organizing for an assault on Greenwood, and in the early morning hours of June 1st, thousands of white men, many of them deputized by city officials and armed by local authorities who distributed weapons from the police armory and from private gun stores, invaded the Greenwood district in a coordinated attack that had the participation and support of local government, law enforcement, and even the Oklahoma National Guard. What followed was systematic destruction on a scale rarely seen in American history, as white mobs moved through Greenwood block by block, looting black homes and businesses before setting them ablaze, shooting black residents who attempted to defend their property or flee the violence, and creating a firestorm that consumed over 35 blocks of the most prosperous black neighborhood in America. Eyewitness accounts and later investigations documented horrific atrocities, including black residents being shot in the streets, bodies being dumped in mass graves, black people being rounded up and held in detention camps, and even reports of white attackers using small aircraft to drop incendiary devices on buildings and to fire on black residents from the air, making the Tulsa Massacre possibly the first aerial assault on American civilians in the nation's history. The Greenwood District, which before the massacre had been home to approximately 10,000 black residents and boasted over 600 successful black-owned businesses including hotels, restaurants, grocery stores, movie theaters, and professional offices, was reduced to smoking rubble, with contemporary photographs showing block after block of total devastation comparable to war zones, with only chimneys and foundations remaining where thriving businesses and homes had stood hours before. The death toll from the massacre has never been definitively established because bodies were disposed of in mass graves, dumped in rivers, or buried in unmarked locations, and because official records were deliberately destroyed or falsified to minimize the scale of the violence. But historians now estimate that between 100 and 300 black residents were killed during the approximately 16 hours of violence, making it one of the deadliest incidents of racial terrorism in American history. In addition to those killed, Thousands of Black Tulsa residents were left homeless, having lost everything they owned to the fires and looting, and approximately 6,000 Black people were detained in internment camps set up by authorities, ostensibly for their own protection but functioning effectively as imprisonment of the victims, while the perpetrators of the violence walked free. The aftermath of the massacre was characterized by a systematic cover-up and denial that would last for decades, with city officials, newspapers, and white civic leaders working to suppress information about the true scale of the violence, to prevent investigation or prosecution of those responsible, and to block attempts by Black survivors to rebuild or receive compensation for their losses. Not a single white person was ever convicted or punished for participating in the massacre, despite thousands being involved in the destruction and murder, while Black residents who attempted to defend themselves or their property were arrested and charged with various crimes, demonstrating once again the racial double standard embedded in American justice. Insurance companies refused to pay claims filed by Black property owners, citing riot exclusions and policies even though the violence constituted organized assault rather than a riot, and rebuilding efforts in Greenwood were hindered by city ordinances that imposed new building codes and zoning restrictions designed to prevent the community from being reconstructed as it had been before. Despite these obstacles, the Greenwood community did eventually rebuild, though it never fully recovered the prosperity and concentration of Black wealth that had made it Black Wall Street, and the massacre itself was effectively erased from official histories, with textbooks omitting it, public discussion being suppressed, and even many Tulsa residents being unaware of the event for decades. It was not until the 1990s that serious historical investigation and public acknowledgement of the massacre began to emerge, prompted by the approaching 75th anniversary and the efforts of survivors and descendants who demanded that the truth be told and that the massacre be recognized as part of American history. In 2001, the Oklahoma Commission to Study the Tulsa Race Riot of 1921 issued a comprehensive report documenting the massacre, confirming the death toll estimates, and recommending reparations for survivors and descendants, though the Oklahoma legislature declined to authorize payments, leaving the question of justice and compensation unresolved. In 2020 and 2021, archaeological investigations using ground-penetrating radar and excavations confirmed the existence of mass graves containing victims of the massacre, providing physical evidence of the atrocities and supporting the accounts of survivors who had testified to seeing bodies dumped in unmarked locations. The Tulsa Race Massacre stands as a stark example of how racial violence in America has been used not just to oppress and terrorize, but to systematically destroy Black economic achievement and to prevent the accumulation of generational wealth that might challenge white economic dominance. And the decades-long cover-up and denial of the massacre demonstrates how historical memory itself becomes a battleground in struggles over race and power. The destruction of Black Wall Street was not random mob violence but coordinated economic warfare designed to eliminate a successful Black community that had dared to prosper and that had represented a living refutation of white supremacist ideology, and the failure to hold anyone accountable, to provide reparations, or even to acknowledge the truth for 7 decades compounded the original crime and demonstrated that terrorism and genocide directed against Black Americans could be committed with impunity and then erased from history through official silence and willful forgetting. Number 5. The Ludlow Massacre, 1914. On April 20, 1914, in Ludlow, Colorado, the Colorado National Guard and private security forces working for the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company attacked a tent colony of striking coal miners and their families, setting fire to the camp and killing approximately 21 people, including 2 women and 11 children who suffocated and burned to death in a pit they had dug beneath their tent for protection, in what became known as the Ludlow Massacre. One of the bloodiest incidents in American labor history and a stark demonstration of the violence that corporations and government forces were willing to deploy to crush worker organizing and maintain exploitative labor conditions. The events leading to the massacre began in September 1913, when approximately 11,000 coal miners across southern Colorado went on strike against the major mining companies, particularly the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company owned by the Rockefeller family, to protest dangerous working conditions, company control over all aspects of miners' lives through the company town system, low wages, and the denial of basic union rights. When the miners went on strike, they were immediately evicted from company-owned housing, and with support from the United Mine Workers Union, they established tent colonies where striker families could live while the labor dispute continued, with the largest of these tent colonies located near Ludlow containing approximately 1,200 people, including hundreds of women and children. The strike was marked from the beginning by violence and intimidation, with the mining companies hiring the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency, a private security firm notorious for strike-breaking and violence against labor organizers, and these armed guards, along with the Colorado National Guard, which was called up by the governor allegedly to keep peace but which functioned effectively as a private army for the mining companies, repeatedly attacked the tent colonies, engaged in random shootings, to terrorize the strikers and arrested and beat union organizers. By April 1914, after 7 months of strike, tensions had reached a breaking point, with both sides armed and hostile, though the strikers had consistently maintained that they were defending themselves and their families against aggression by company forces and the National Guard rather than initiating violence. On the morning of April 20th, the National Guard positioned a machine gun on a ridge overlooking the Ludlow tent colony and began firing into the camp, and the reasons for initiating this attack have never been clearly established, with guardsmen later claiming they were responding to shots from the camp while survivors testified that the attack was unprovoked and that the guardsmen had been drinking and were looking for confrontation. As machine gun fire raked the tent colony, miners and their families scrambled for cover, with some men grabbing weapons to return fire while women and children sought shelter in pits they had dug beneath their tents to provide protection during previous attacks, a precaution that would prove tragically inadequate against what was to come. The battle continued throughout the day, with guardsmen and company guards advancing on the camp while firing repeatedly, and as evening approached, soldiers and guards moved into the tent colony itself, looting tents and then systematically setting fire to the camp, using kerosene to ensure that the tents would burn completely and quickly. As fire swept through the colony, residents who had been pinned down by gunfire were forced to flee, and in the chaos and darkness, many became separated from family members or were shot as they tried to escape the flames. The following morning revealed the full horror of the massacre when the charred remains of 2 women and 11 children were discovered in a pit beneath one of the burned tents, where they had taken shelter during the attack only to die from suffocation and burns as the tent above them was deliberately set ablaze and collapsed into the pit, creating a death trap from which they could not escape. The total death toll from the Ludlow Massacre is estimated at approximately 21 people, including the 13 in the pit, plus strikers who were killed in the initial gunfire and in subsequent fighting, though exact numbers remain uncertain because some bodies may have been removed or hidden, and because the violence continued for days after the initial attack in what became known as the 10-Day War, as miners from surrounding camps armed themselves and launched reprisal attacks against mine property and guards, leading to additional deaths before federal troops were finally deployed to restore order. The discovery of the burned women and children in what became known as the death pit generated national outrage and focused public attention on the brutality of the mining companies and their willingness to use lethal force against not just striking workers but their families, including small children who had nothing to do with the labor dispute and who died simply because they were present in the tent colony their fathers had established to continue the fight for basic rights and decent working conditions. The aftermath of Ludlow saw congressional investigations, widespread labor unrest and sympathy strikes across the country, and eventually some reforms in labor law and coal mine safety regulations, but in terms of immediate justice, the results were deeply unsatisfying to the victims and their supporters. A military court of inquiry exonerated the National Guard of wrongdoing, finding that the deaths were unfortunate results of a battle initiated by the strikers, a conclusion that contradicted eyewitness testimony and physical evidence but that reflected the bias of military investigators toward the troops they were examining. Several National Guardsmen and company guards were arrested and charged with murder, but in trials held in Los Animas County where mining company influence was substantial, juries either acquitted the defendants or hung without reaching verdicts, and no one was ever convicted or punished for the deaths at Ludlow. Similarly, several miners who had participated in the 10-Day War reprisal attacks were arrested and tried for murder of company guards, and while some were convicted and sentenced to prison, others were eventually pardoned, reflecting the complex and contested nature of assigning responsibility for violence that had emerged from months of escalating conflict and provocation. The Ludlow Massacre became a rallying cry for the American labor movement and a symbol of corporate and government violence against workers, demonstrating that companies and the state would literally burn women and children alive rather than allow workers to organize and demand better conditions. And the image of the death pit where 13 people had been incinerated became one of the most powerful indictments of industrial capitalism's human cost. The Colorado Fuel and Iron Company and the Rockefeller family faced intense criticism and public relations disaster following Ludlow, leading John D. Rockefeller Jr. to hire public relations consultant Ivy Lee to improve the company's image and to eventually implement some reforms in company policies. Though these changes came too late for those who died at Ludlow and were motivated more by concern for corporate reputation than genuine commitment to worker welfare. The United Mine Workers Union erected a monument at the site of the massacre in 1918, and the location has been preserved as a reminder of the violence and a memorial to those who died, with the rusted remains of the death pit still visible as a physical testament to what happened there. The Ludlow Massacre occurred during a period of intense labor conflict in American history, when workers organizing for basic rights faced violent opposition not just from private security forces, but from state and federal governments that sided consistently with corporate interests against labor, and the willingness to use military force, including machine guns and arson against unarmed women and children, demonstrated the extent to which the existing power structure would go to prevent any challenge to its control over workers and resources. While the massacre did eventually contribute to reforms including improved labor laws, coal mine safety regulations, and some recognition of union rights, these changes came slowly and were bitterly contested, and the fundamental power imbalance between capital and labor that led to Ludlow persisted in various forms throughout the 20th century and continues to shape economic and social relations today. Number 4. The Wounded Knee Massacre, 1890. On December 29, 1890, on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota, the United States 7th Cavalry surrounded a camp of Lakota Sioux led by Chief Bigfoot and opened fire with rifles and Hotchkiss cannons, killing approximately 300 Native Americans including women, children, and elderly people in what became known as the Wounded Knee Massacre, the final major armed encounter between Native Americans and the United States military and a brutal conclusion to centuries of genocidal violence against indigenous peoples across North America. The events leading to the massacre were rooted in the desperate conditions facing Native Americans on reservations in the late 19th century, as tribes that had been forcibly relocated from their traditional lands found themselves confined to barren territories, dependent on government rations that were frequently inadequate or withheld, prohibited from practicing their traditional ways of life, and subject to policies explicitly designed to destroy their cultures and assimilate them into white society. In this context of desperation and suffering, a religious movement known as the Ghost Dance emerged among Western tribes, promising that faithful practitioners could bring about the return of deceased ancestors, the restoration of traditional ways of life, and the disappearance of white settlers through spiritual means rather than armed resistance. While the Ghost Dance was fundamentally a peaceful religious movement expressing the grief and hope of traumatized peoples, white authorities and military officials viewed it as a potential precursor to armed uprising and demanded that it be suppressed, leading to increased tensions on reservations and the deployment of additional troops ostensibly to maintain order but effectively to intimidate Native peoples and prevent any possibility of resistance. In December 1890, the legendary Lakota leader Sitting Bull, who had allowed ghost dance ceremonies on the Standing Rock Reservation, was killed by Indian Agency police during an attempted arrest, and fearing similar attempts against other leaders, Chief Bigfoot decided to lead his band of approximately 350 Miniconjou Lakota from the Cheyenne River Reservation to the Pine Ridge Reservation to seek protection and to distance his people from the increasing military presence. Bigfoot himself was ill with pneumonia and riding in a wagon as his band traveled south, and on December 28th, the group was intercepted by the 7th Cavalry, the same unit that had been decimated by Lakota and Cheyenne warriors at the Battle of Little Bighorn 14 years earlier, a fact that undoubtedly influenced the attitudes and actions of the soldiers who now had these Native Americans at their mercy. The cavalry escorted Bigfoot's band to a camp at Wounded Knee Creek, surrounded them with approximately 500 troops, and positioned 4 rapid-fire Hotchkiss cannons on a hill overlooking the camp, a military deployment that was vastly disproportionate to any possible threat posed by a group consisting largely of women, children, and elderly people traveling peacefully toward a reservation. On the morning of December 29th, the cavalry commander Colonel James Forsyth ordered the Lakota men to gather in front of their camp to be disarmed, and soldiers then entered the camp to search for weapons, conducting the search in an aggressive and disrespectful manner that included overturning belongings and handling women in ways that caused alarm and resistance. As the search continued, a medicine man named Yellow Bird began performing the ghost dance and encouraging the Lakota not to fear the soldiers' bullets, which the ghost dance religion taught could not harm believers. And in this tense atmosphere, a scuffle broke out when soldiers attempted to disarm a deaf man named Black Coyote, who could not hear their commands and who raised his rifle over his head either in defiance or confusion, and a shot was fired, though accounts differ on whether it came from Black Coyote's rifle or from a soldier's weapon. What happened next was systematic slaughter, as soldiers immediately opened fire on the gathered Lakota men at point-blank range, mowing them down where they stood, and when some Lakota managed to retrieve weapons and began fighting back, the Hotchkiss cannons on the hill opened fire, launching explosive shells into the camp where women and children were gathered, tearing bodies apart and setting teepees ablaze, while soldiers with rifles shot anyone who moved, including people attempting to flee, or to shield children from the gunfire. The killing spread across a wide area as Lakota people ran in all directions trying to escape, and soldiers pursued them, hunting down and shooting women and children who posed no possible threat, with some victims being killed as far as 3 miles from the initial camp, demonstrating that this was not defensive action but deliberate hunting and execution of fleeing refugees. When the massacre ended, approximately 300 Lakota were dead, with some estimates running higher, and the bodies were left where they had fallen, freezing in a blizzard that struck that night. And when burial parties arrived 3 days later on New Year's Day 1891, they found bodies frozen in positions that told the story of the massacre, including mothers covering children with their bodies, families huddled together, and people shot in the back as they fled. The dead were dumped into a mass grave on the hill where the Hotchkiss cannons had been positioned, photographed for curious white audiences, and buried with minimal ceremony or respect, while wounded survivors, many of them women and children with horrific injuries, were transported to Pine Ridge where some received medical care though many died from their wounds in the following days and weeks. The United States military classified Wounded Knee as a battle rather than a massacre, and astoundingly, awarded 20 medals of honor to soldiers who had participated in the killing, the highest military decoration possible, given for actions that included shooting unarmed women and children, pursuing and killing fleeing refugees, and firing explosive cannons into a camp of non-combatants, a perversion of military honor that stands as one of the most shameful episodes in American military history. In the immediate aftermath, military officials and government authorities justified the massacre by claiming that the Lakota had initiated hostilities and that the soldiers had simply returned fire and acted in self-defense. But evidence including the locations and nature of wounds, the distances at which many victims were killed while fleeing, and the disproportionate casualties with 300 Lakota dead, compared to approximately 25 soldiers killed mostly by friendly fire from their own side, all demonstrated that Wounded Knee was a massacre of largely unarmed and non-threatening people rather than a legitimate military engagement. The Wounded Knee Massacre marked the effective end of the Indian Wars and the final military defeat of Native American resistance to the United States continental expansion, and it occurred at a time when Native peoples had already been militarily conquered, confined to reservations, and stripped of their lands and traditional ways of life, making the violence at Wounded Knee not a battle for survival or territory but a final act of genocidal violence against a people who had already been defeated and who posed no threat to the American nation. The historical significance of Wounded Knee extends beyond the immediate tragedy to represent the culmination of centuries of violence, dispossession, forced removal, cultural destruction, and genocide perpetrated against indigenous peoples across North America in service of westward expansion and the creation of the United States as a continental nation. And the mass grave at Wounded Knee contains not just the bodies of those killed on December 29, 1890, but symbolizes the deaths of thousands of Native Americans killed in similar violent encounters throughout American history. For Native American communities, Wounded Knee has become a powerful symbol of historical trauma, cultural survival, and resistance, and the site itself was the location of a famous occupation and standoff in 1973 when members of the American Indian movement seized the town to protest conditions on reservations and to demand that the United States government honor treaties and address historical injustices, an action that resulted in another violent confrontation and additional deaths, and that demonstrated the continuing legacy of Wounded Knee in struggles for Native sovereignty and rights. Efforts to rescind the medals of honor awarded for the massacre have been ongoing for decades, but have been unsuccessful despite clear evidence that the honors were awarded for actions that constituted war crimes rather than legitimate military valor, reflecting the resistance within American institutions to fully acknowledging and addressing historical crimes against Native peoples. The Wounded Knee Massacre stands as an enduring reminder that the founding and expansion of the United States was built on systematic violence against indigenous peoples, that genocide was not an accidental byproduct of westward expansion but a deliberate policy, and that the failure to fully acknowledge these historical crimes and to provide meaningful restitution and justice continues to impact Native American communities today through ongoing poverty, social problems, and political marginalization that are the direct legacy of centuries of violence, dispossession, and cultural destruction, of which Wounded Knee was only the most symbolically significant example. Number 3. The Haun's Mill Massacre, 1838 on October 30th, 1838, in Caldwell County, Missouri. A mob of approximately 240 men from the Missouri State Militia attacked a Mormon settlement at Haun's Mill, killing 17 men and boys, including children as young as 9 years old, in a massacre that represented both religious persecution and frontier violence, and that occurred in the context of the Missouri Mormon War, a period of intense conflict between Mormon settlers and other Missouri residents that resulted in the forced expulsion of thousands of Mormons from the state. The events leading to the Haun's Mill Massacre were rooted in the rapid growth of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Missouri during the 1830s, as Mormon converts moved to the state in large numbers, establishing their own communities and voting as a bloc in ways that threatened the political and economic power of earlier settlers, while their religious beliefs and practices, including communal property ownership and opposition to slavery in a state where slavery was legal, made them targets of suspicion and hostility. Throughout 1838, tensions escalated into open conflict with attacks on both Mormon and non-Mormon communities, and Missouri Governor Lilburn Boggs issued what became known as the Extermination Order on October 27, 1838, declaring that the Mormons must be treated as enemies and must be exterminated or driven from the state if necessary for the public peace, an order that effectively gave legal sanction to violence against Mormon communities and created the context in which the Haun's Mill Massacre would occur 3 days later. Haun's Mill was a small Mormon settlement of approximately 75 people located on Shoal Creek, centered around a blacksmith shop and grist mill owned by Jacob Haun, and on the afternoon of October 30th, the settlement was going about its usual business, with men working at the mill and blacksmith shop, women preparing meals and caring for children, and no indication of the violence that was about to descend on them. At approximately 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the militia mob approached the settlement, and although some settlers saw them coming and called for everyone to seek shelter, there was no time to mount a defense or to flee, and the attackers immediately opened fire on everyone they saw, including men who were attempting to surrender and who were waving white flags to indicate they were not resisting. The main killing occurred at the blacksmith shop, where approximately 30 Mormon men and boys had taken shelter, and the militiamen surrounded the building and fired through the gaps between the logs, shooting into the confined space where the settlers had nowhere to hide or escape, turning the blacksmith shop into a death trap filled with gunsmoke and screaming as bullets tore through the bodies of men trying to shield children or find any cover that might protect them from the barrage. Among those killed was 10-year-old Sardius Smith, who had hidden under the blacksmith's bellows, and after the initial volley of gunfire, a militiaman found the wounded boy and shot him in the head at point-blank range, later justifying this murder by saying, "Nits will make lice," meaning that Mormon children would grow up to be Mormon adults and therefore needed to be killed to completely eliminate the Mormon presence, a statement that revealed the genocidal intent underlying the attack. Also killed was 78-year-old Thomas McBride, a Revolutionary War veteran who had surrendered and given up his gun to one of the militiamen, only to be shot and hacked to death with his own gun and a corn knife in a brutal murder that demonstrated the militia's complete disregard for the conventions of warfare or basic human decency. When the shooting finally stopped after what survivors estimated was about 15 minutes of sustained gunfire, 17 Mormon men and boys were dead or dying, 13 others were wounded, and the attackers began looting the settlement, taking weapons, horses, household goods, and anything else of value, while also violating the bodies of the dead and threatening survivors who attempted to care for the wounded or prepare the dead for burial. The survivors, consisting primarily of women, children, and wounded men, were left to deal with the aftermath of the massacre with no help from authorities, and with the knowledge that they remained in danger of further attack. And that night they worked by candlelight to treat the wounded and prepare the dead for burial, while also preparing to flee the area before the militia returned. The bodies of the victims were buried the following day in a large well on the property because the ground was too hard to dig individual graves, and because the survivors feared that if they left bodies above ground, the militia would return and mutilate them, and this mass grave became a symbol of the massacre and of the persecution that Mormons faced in Missouri. In the days and weeks following the Haun's Mill Massacre, Mormon communities throughout Missouri were forced to flee the state, with thousands leaving their homes, farms, and property behind and traveling to Illinois in the dead of winter, suffering from exposure, disease, and starvation, in an exodus that represented one of the largest forced religious migrations in American history. The leaders of the massacre were never prosecuted or punished despite the clear evidence of their actions and the identities of many participants being known. And the state of Missouri did not rescind Governor Boggs' extermination order until 1976, 138 years after it was issued, a delay that demonstrated the state's long refusal to acknowledge or apologize for its role in the persecution and expulsion of the Mormons. The Haun's Mill Massacre has been memorialized within the Mormon community as a defining event in the history of the church and as evidence of the persecution that early members faced. And the site of the massacre has been preserved with a monument marking the location of the mass grave and commemorating those who died. The massacre demonstrates how religious difference combined with political and economic conflict can lead to extreme violence, and how state authorities not only failed to protect a vulnerable religious minority but actively encouraged violence against them through official orders that legitimized persecution and murder. The killing of children, the execution of those who had surrendered, the mutilation of the dead, and the complete lack of accountability for those responsible all illustrate how easily ordinary citizens can commit atrocities when they believe they have official sanction and when they view their victims as fundamentally different or threatening to their way of life. The Haun's Mill Massacre also reveals the violence that characterized the American frontier in the 19th century, where conflicts over land, resources, political power, and cultural differences frequently escalated into armed confrontation, and where legal institutions were often absent, ineffective, or captured by one side in disputes, allowing violence to proceed unchecked and without consequences. For the Mormon community, Haun's Mill became part of a larger narrative of persecution that would eventually lead to their migration west to Utah and the establishment of a religious state where they could practice their faith without fear of violent attack, though even there they would face continued conflict with federal authorities, demonstrating that religious minorities in 19th century America faced systematic persecution and violence that was often sanctioned or ignored by government at all levels. Number 2. The Mountain Meadows Massacre, 1857. On September 11, 1857, in southern Utah Territory, a group of Mormon militiamen and their Paiute Indian allies attacked a wagon train of approximately 140 Arkansas immigrants known as the Baker Fancher Party, and after a 5-day siege followed by a false promise of safe conduct, the attackers systematically murdered approximately 120 men, women, and children, sparing only 17 children deemed too young to remember and report what had happened, in what became known as the Mountain Meadows Massacre, one of the worst crimes in the history of the American West and a dark episode in Mormon history that revealed how religious extremism, territorial paranoia, and frontier violence could combine to produce genocidal atrocity. The events leading to the massacre occurred during a period of extreme tension between the Mormon community in Utah Territory and the United States federal government, which had sent an army to Utah in what became known as the Utah War to assert federal authority over what it viewed as a theocratic territory in rebellion against American law. And in this context, Mormon leaders, including Brigham Young, had declared martial law, were preaching inflammatory sermons about defending the territory from Gentile invasion, and had created an atmosphere of siege mentality and paranoia that would contribute to the decision to attack the immigrant wagon train. The Baker Fancher Party was a prosperous group of immigrants from Arkansas and Missouri traveling to California, and as they passed through southern Utah in late August 1857, they encountered increasing hostility from Mormon settlements, with residents refusing to trade with them or provide supplies, based partly on orders from church leaders to conserve resources in preparation for the expected war with federal forces, and partly on suspicion and hostility toward all outsiders during this period of crisis. As the wagon train continued south through the territory, local Mormon leaders in the Cedar City area, particularly stake President Isaac Haight and militia commander John D. Lee, became convinced that the emigrants posed a threat to the Mormon community, whether through military intelligence they might provide to federal forces, through their presence in the territory during a time of crisis, or through alleged insults and provocations that emigrants had supposedly directed at Mormon settlers. Along the route, though historians have found little credible evidence that the Baker Fancher Party behaved significantly differently from other immigrant groups or that they posed any actual threat to Mormon communities. Nevertheless, Mormon leaders in southern Utah decided that the wagon train should be destroyed and all the emigrants killed to prevent them from reaching California and potentially reporting on conditions in Utah or providing information to federal authorities, and they developed a plan to carry out the massacre while attempting to conceal Mormon involvement by recruiting Paiute Indians to participate in the attack and by disguising Mormon militiamen as Indians. On September 7, 1857, as the Baker Fancher party camped at Mountain Meadows, a traditional stopping place in a valley with water and grass, the attackers struck, firing on the wagon train from surrounding hills and beginning a siege that would last 5 days, during which the emigrants circled their wagons, dug defensive positions, and fought off repeated attacks while suffering from lack of water and increasing casualties from the sustained gunfire. After 5 days of siege, with the emigrants desperate and running low on ammunition and water, John D. Lee approached the wagon train under a white flag and negotiated what he claimed would be safe passage, convincing the emigrants that if they surrendered their weapons and agreed to be escorted out of the valley by Mormon militiamen, they would be protected from the Indians and allowed to continue their journey, a promise that was a calculated deception designed to make the emigrants vulnerable and to facilitate their murder. The emigrants, having no reason to suspect that Mormon settlers would massacre them and believing they were being rescued from Indian attack, agreed to the terms, gave up their weapons, and began walking out of the valley in a column with men separated from the women and children, each man walking beside a Mormon militiaman who was supposedly protecting him. After walking approximately a mile from the camp, at a prearranged signal, the Mormon militiamen turned and shot the men they had been walking beside, killing them at point-blank range in a coordinated execution, while other attackers, both Mormons and Paiutes, fell upon the women and children who were following behind, shooting and clubbing them to death in a frenzy of violence that spared no one except the youngest children who were judged too young to provide testimony about what had happened. The massacre claimed approximately 120 lives, with survivors numbering only 17 children, all under the age of 7, and the bodies of the victims were left on the ground or covered with brush in shallow graves that were quickly exposed by animals, remaining visible for years afterward as a grim testament to the crime that had been committed. In the immediate aftermath, Mormon leaders attempted to cover up their involvement by claiming that Paiute Indians had committed the massacre with minimal or no Mormon participation, and they collected the surviving children and initially held them in Mormon homes in southern Utah before eventually, after federal pressure and investigation, returning them to relatives in Arkansas nearly 2 years later. The cover-up was extensive and involved not only local participants but extended to highest levels of Mormon leadership, with evidence suggesting that while Brigham Young may not have directly ordered the massacre, he and other church leaders were aware of what had happened and actively participated in covering it up and protecting those responsible. For nearly 20 years, the perpetrators of the Mountain Meadows Massacre lived freely in Utah, protected by a wall of silence within the Mormon community and by the difficulty federal authorities faced in investigating crimes in a territory where they had limited authority and where the population was united in refusing to cooperate with investigations. It was not until 1874 that John D. Lee, the Mormon militia commander who had led the final phase of the massacre and who had personally participated in the killings, was arrested and charged with murder, and even then his first trial in 1875 resulted in a hung jury when the all-Mormon jury refused to convict despite overwhelming evidence. In a second trial in 1876, with a mixed jury of Mormons and non-Mormons and with the Mormon Church having decided that Lee would serve as a scapegoat to protect other participants and church leaders, Lee was convicted of murder and sentenced to death, and on March 23, 1877, he was executed by firing squad at Mountain Meadows, sitting on his own coffin at the site of the massacre, the only person ever held legally accountable for a crime that involved dozens of participants and that had the knowledge and implicit sanction of Mormon leadership. Lee maintained until his death that he had been following orders from church leaders and that he was being sacrificed to protect more important figures, claims that were supported by evidence but that the church denied for more than a century. The Mormon Church's official position on the Mountain Meadows Massacre evolved slowly over the following decades, from complete denial of Mormon involvement to acknowledgement of participation by some local members acting without authorization to finally, in 2007, 150 years after the massacre, official acknowledgement from the church leadership that the massacre was a terrible crime committed by Mormons, though still characterizing it as the action of local leaders rather than acknowledging the broader involvement of church hierarchy. The Mountain Meadows Massacre remains one of the most controversial and painful episodes in Mormon history, and it raises profound questions about how religious communities deal with crimes committed in the name of their faith, about the mechanisms of cover-up and denial that allow such crimes to go unpunished, and about the responsibility of leadership for creating conditions and rhetoric that encourage violence even when they may not explicitly order it. The massacre also demonstrates how fear, paranoia, and siege mentality can transform ordinary people into mass murderers, as many of the Mormon participants in the massacre were not criminals or violent individuals but farmers, merchants, and religious believers who convinced themselves that killing men, women, and children was necessary to protect their community and their faith. The fact that women and children were specifically targeted for murder after being promised safe passage reveals the calculated nature of the crime and the desire to eliminate all witnesses who might testify to Mormon involvement, and the decision to spare only the youngest children reflects both a slight hesitation at murdering toddlers and infants and a pragmatic calculation that children under 7 could not provide credible testimony in court. The 17 surviving children who were returned to Arkansas carried with them fragmented memories and stories of the massacre that would haunt them for the rest of their lives, and some of them bore scars from bullet wounds or other injuries suffered during the attack, providing living testimony to a crime that many wanted to forget or deny. The site of the Mountain Meadows Massacre has been marked by various monuments over the years, with controversies over how to memorialize the victims and how to characterize the event, reflecting ongoing debates about responsibility, remembrance, and reconciliation. And in 1999, a comprehensive memorial was finally completed honoring all the victims and acknowledging the tragedy without qualification or excuse, providing a measure of recognition to those who died and to their descendants who had fought for more than a century to have the truth acknowledged and the victims properly commemorated. Number 1. The Tulsa bombing of 1921 and the destruction of Black Wall Street. 1921, the massacre that occurred on May 31st and June 1st, 1921, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, already described in detail as number 6 of this compilation, deserves recognition as the number 1 massacre that shocked America not only for the scale of death and destruction but for representing a systematic attempt to destroy Black prosperity and economic achievement through coordinated violence that involved thousands of white Tulsa residents, local government officials, law enforcement, and even the National Guard, making it one of the worst incidents of racial terrorism in American history, and one that combined individual murders, mass violence, economic warfare, and aerial bombardment in a 2-day rampage that left as many as 300 Black residents dead, over 35 blocks of the prosperous Greenwood district completely destroyed, and approximately 10,000 African Americans homeless and stripped of all their property and possessions. The Greenwood district of Tulsa had been known as Black Wall Street because it represented one of the most successful concentrations of Black-owned businesses and Black wealth in America, with the community including not just shops and restaurants but banks, hotels, hospitals, schools, law offices, and every form of commercial enterprise, creating an economic ecosystem where Black residents could live, work, and prosper without depending on white-owned businesses, and where the circulation of money within the Black community created generational wealth and opportunity that directly challenged white supremacist narratives about Black inferiority and inability to succeed. The prosperity and independence of Greenwood represented a direct threat to white economic and social dominance in Tulsa, and the massacre that destroyed it was not a spontaneous riot, but a calculated act of economic terrorism designed to eliminate this Black prosperity and to reassert white control over the city's economy and social order. What sets the Tulsa Massacre apart from other incidents of racial violence and places it at the top of this list is the combination of factors that made it uniquely devastating, including the scale of destruction with over 35 blocks completely burned, the death toll estimated between 100 and 300 people, making it one of the deadliest incidents of racial violence in American history, the use of aircraft to bomb and strafe a civilian population, making it possibly the first aerial assault on American soil, the active participation of law enforcement and government officials who armed white mobs and arrested Black residents attempting to defend themselves, the complete destruction of an economically thriving community representing millions of dollars in property loss, the systematic cover-up that erased the massacre from official history for 70 years, and the total lack of accountability with not a single perpetrator ever prosecuted or punished despite thousands participating in the violence and despite the identities of leaders and organizers being well known. The events were triggered by an incident in an elevator between Dick Rowland, a 19-year-old Black shoe shiner, and Sarah Page, a 17-year-old white elevator operator, that led to Rowland's arrest and threats of lynching, But the response went far beyond any conceivable reaction to an alleged individual crime and instead became a pretext for the white community to destroy Greenwood entirely, suggesting that the underlying motivation was not punishment for a specific offense but elimination of black economic success and independence that challenged the racial hierarchy. When armed black men traveled to the courthouse to prevent Rowland's lynching, offering to help law enforcement protect him, their presence was viewed as intolerable defiance of white authority, and after a confrontation in which shots were fired, white Tulsa organized for systematic assault on Greenwood with a level of coordination and planning that indicates this was not spontaneous mob violence but organized military-style attack. Throughout the night of May 31st and into June 1st, thousands of white men, many of them deputized by police and armed with weapons provided by law enforcement and even taken from the National Guard Armory, invaded Greenwood in coordinated waves, moving block by block through the district, shooting black residents on sight, looting every business and home before setting them ablaze, and creating a firestorm that consumed the entire community in what witnesses described as looking like a war zone with flames visible for miles and smoke rising in enormous clouds over the city. The use of aircraft to drop incendiary devices and to fire on fleeing black residents represented a shocking escalation that brought the tactics of modern warfare to bear on American civilians, and photographs from the period show small planes flying over Greenwood during the attack, confirming accounts from survivors who described bombs being dropped and shots being fired from the air. The National Guard, which arrived ostensibly to restore order, instead participated in the violence by rounding up black residents and forcing them into detention camps, where approximately 6,000 people were held for days under armed guard, effectively imprisoning the victims while the perpetrators walked free, and guardsmen also assisted in burning buildings and preventing black residents from defending their property or escaping the violence. The aftermath of the massacre saw systematic efforts to prevent black residents from rebuilding, with city ordinances suddenly imposing new building codes and restrictions that made reconstruction prohibitively expensive, insurance companies refusing to honor policies by claiming riot exclusions, and white business interests attempting to seize the valuable land in Greenwood for their own development, demonstrating that the goal was not just to punish but to permanently eliminate black economic power in Tulsa. The deliberate destruction of records, the removal and concealment of bodies in mass graves, the intimidation of witnesses, and the complete censorship of the massacre from textbooks and public discussion for 70 years all demonstrate a coordinated effort not just to commit violence but to erase it from history and prevent any accountability or reparation. The comparison between the Tulsa Massacre and other incidents of racial violence in American history reveals important differences in scale, organization, and consequence, as Tulsa involved not just a mob but the entire apparatus of city government and law enforcement, not just individual murders but the systematic destruction of an entire community, not just spontaneous violence but planned economic warfare, and not just temporary displacement but permanent elimination of black wealth and property. The fact that the massacre occurred in 1921, not during slavery or Reconstruction but in the 20th century during a period often characterized as modern and progressive, demonstrates that racial terrorism and genocide directed against African Americans persisted long after the formal end of slavery and represented an ongoing strategy to prevent black economic advancement and political power. The economic impact of the Tulsa Massacre extended far beyond the immediate loss of property and business, as it destroyed generational wealth that would have been passed down to descendants, eliminated the economic infrastructure that allowed black businesses to thrive, and sent a message to black communities across America that prosperity and success could be met with total destruction, creating a chilling effect on black economic ambition and organizing. The psychological trauma inflicted on survivors who watched their entire community burned, who saw family members murdered, who lost everything they had built, and who were then imprisoned and blamed for the violence they had suffered created wounds that lasted generations and that were compounded by the forced silence and denial that prevented them from even speaking about what they had experienced. The fact that it took until the 1990s for serious investigation and public acknowledgement to begin, until 2001 for an official state commission report, until 2020 for archaeological confirmation of mass graves, and still no reparations or full justice for survivors and descendants demonstrates the ongoing nature of the harm and the continued resistance to fully addressing the crime and its consequences. The Tulsa Massacre represents the intersection of individual racial violence, systemic racism, economic warfare, government complicity, and historical erasure, making it not just one massacre among many but a defining event that reveals the extent to which American society has been willing to use total destruction and genocide to maintain white supremacy and to prevent Black Americans from achieving economic equality and independence, and the fact that the massacre remains relatively unknown. Outside of Oklahoma and specialist historical circles, despite being one of the deadliest and most destructive incidents of racial violence in American history, demonstrates how successfully the forces of denial and erasure have operated to keep this history hidden and to prevent the kind of national reckoning and accountability that such a crime demands.